Hello, in this video I'm covering the game 2 of semifinals between Leinier Dominguez and Levon Aronian from the Grand Prix in Berlin. In the first game, Levon beat Dominguez with white pieces, and now Dominguez has to beat him back with white pieces. And let's see what happened. Dominguez played e4, after which Levon had a very solid opening choice. Dominguez played the Italian game, which he played against Wesley So in the tiebreaks. And now Levon chose knight f6, and after d3, bishop e7. A very solid setup by black, keeping his bishop closer to the king. If you compare this to bishop c5 variation, it's less solid because the bishop will be outside the pawn chain after d6, and after that the king has less protection. So he chose this, something like Hungarian defense, I would say. But Hungarian defense is, I think, immediately bishop e7 here. But never mind the naming of the openings, let's go back to the game. So Levon played bishop e7, castles, and now rook e1. Slowly preparing some d4 break. d6 by black. Now if you start pushing d4, it's not as good because black will have bishop g4. Because of this pin on the h5 d1 diagonal, it's not so easy to push d4 so early. And white delays this, and he plays a4 first. One issue with white's position is that his bishop would be trapped if not for a4, or let's say c3. I think that's also a pretty nice response, but as you will see, it transposed to that variation. So a4 was played to have a2 in case of knight a5, which was played anyways. Knight a5, bishop a2, and now c5. By c5 he's trying to stop the expansion in the center, or on the queen side by b4. Dominguez plays c3 to prepare both b4 to kick this knight away, or d4 to break in the center. Aronian goes back to c6. Now b4 is impossible, and if you play d4 that's premature, because after cd, now the bishop is not protecting the king side, so bishop g4 is very strong here. And in case of d, there's knight e5. Now this pin can be a bit uncomfortable for white. It's not time for d4 just yet. He goes knight a3, heading towards c2 and preparing this d4 or b4 break. And now bishop e6 by Levon. And now again, if you play d4, black takes, and I think here that bishop g4 is very strong, pinning the knight. Now after d5 there is knight d4, and white cannot avoid doubling his pawns on the f-file. So in this position, Dominguez, instead of playing d4, plays bishop e6, and we have fe. Now if white pushes d4, it's interesting, but black can take twice like this, 3 times, and go knight g4. And after, let's say, rook e2, there's bishop f6, and black gets some counterplay because he has certain pressure on the b2 pawn, and these weak pawns are not yet going to be exploited. Black can go queen b6 in the future and put one of his rooks on d8, the second one on c8, and completely compensate this weakness on e6 and d6. In this position, the bishop on c1 is the only piece which is left to develop. If you go with bishop g5 here, then there is knight h5 with knight f4 next. And I think black would have pretty good counterplay on the king side. So what else? If you go bishop e3, then you allow d5, which is not so good for white. Once you allow as white d5, it becomes easier for black to play, to gain more space. So he went for bishop d2. The idea behind this move is to play b4 next, to try to expand on the queen side. And now Levon played a6, b4 by Dominguez, takes, and now d5. Knight c2 by Dominguez. For example, if you go with e d5, now black can capture with the queen. And now the b4 pawn is under attack, so white has to do something about it. But also, if you go knight c4 here, there's e4. And even if you allow knight b6, that's nothing, because after queen d8, knight a8, ef3, the knight on a8 is lost. Black has a very good position here because he will have 2 pieces for a rook. So that's why he played knight c2 first, but this move allowed b5 to fix the b4 pawn. After a couple of more moves, exchange. Now Dominguez took on d5 to attack the e5 pawn, knight d5, knight e5, but now the b4 pawn hangs, and lots of simplifications appear on the board, which is something that Levon wants. Now if white tries to avoid the exchange somehow by knight d4, there is bishop c5, and then the f2 pawn becomes quite vulnerable, and then the knight has to go back to f3 like this, and knight c6 is a very nice move, with the point being that after this there is bishop f2, and after king f2 there is queen a7 check, winning back the knight, and also keeping the king very awkwardly placed. After this, white had to exchange more or less, either on e3 or just to keep it on c2, but he took on b4, knight b4, and now Dominguez played queen b3, trying to attack both knight on b4 and pawn on e6. Maybe the better choice to play for some advantage was to play queen b1, because you'll see what happened in the game, and that just didn't help Dominguez at all. After queen b1, you attack the knight. What can be done? There's bishop c5, neglecting the knight on b4 and hitting the f2. And in case of bishop b4, there's rook f2, threatening checkmate and some nasty discovery like rook b2. But white can just be calm and play knight f3, bishop b6 by black, because you don't really want to allow this position, after which black gives up bishop knight rook for a queen, which should be winning for white. He just does bishop b6. He keeps the option of going rook b2 next. If king h1, there is a nice tactic, rook f3. And now you cannot capture, of course, because of checkmate. What does black do? If you go d4, then he just captures it. And still there is this threat of rook b2 or rook f3. Again, if you do something like bishop c3, there's no rook b2 because bishop d4 just wins more material. I think you can go back to b6. What can be done? Bishop d4 doesn't work because of taking. And if you take with the knight, then oopsie, queen g2. d4 doesn't help too much. After bishop c5, I think the best option was to play d4. And after knight d4, to go back to f3 with the knight. But then black has exchange sacrifice with this, and queen f3. With only those two pawns on the king side, it's going to be tough for white to convert this advantage. The knight can jump to d3 and attack the f2 pawn, so it can be quite tricky for white to deal with this position. But never mind, let's go back to the game. Let's go back to the game and see what happened there. Dominguez played queen b3. He attacks the b4 knight, but now Levon plays queen d5. That was the difference between two lines. Now you don't have time for bishop b4 because the queen is loose. So now if you exchange, that just leads to equal position. After this, knight c6, let's say, king f7. And after rook b1, in this case, now the b5 pawn seems lost. And black can go for b4 here. If something captures on b4, then there is this uncomfortable pin on the b file by rook b8, and white is losing a piece. White can first capture on e7, but after king takes, if he takes on b4, this rook endgame is not something that Dominguez was looking forward to, and after a couple of more moves, after king f6, this endgame is a draw, because the d pawn is loose, the pawns are on the same side, and it's easy for black to manage this extra pawn by white. For example, if the pawn was on e3 on white's side, then maybe there are some potential chances since he has a better structure, but with this pawn structure, with the d pawn as weak as the e6 pawn, it's highly unlikely that black will have any issues in the following endgame. So Dominguez played here rook b1. Now Levon took on e5, and now we had more exchanges. After bishop b4, takes, queen e2. Now he attacks the f2 pawn and also d3 pawn. So that's why Dominguez tries to defend by queen c5, but after capturing, now white wants to capture on b5, but he cannot do it with the rook, which he would like, not to exchange any pieces. He does it with queen Queen b5, rook b5, and now we have dead equal endgame. And after a couple of more moves, because there is regulation of 30 moves without a draw offer, so they had to play it out. After rook d8, g3, king f7, and after a couple of more moves, they agreed to a draw, and that's how Levon Aronian qualified for the final. In the final, his opponent is going to be Hikaru Nakamura, who beat Richard Rapport in the semi-final. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section. See you soon and bye.